Next one is the NC and IC sharing. So I will let Leora provide her slides, and she can present her what is happening internationally.
Thank you, Gabe. Let me see if I can share my presentation. Sorry, here we go. So good afternoon to everyone. My name is Leora. I'm rather new to this committee, and I'm still learning all the acronyms and the jargon of the SDGs working group, WG, SDG, and I find that just getting into the things. Thank you for asking me to present today, and we try to do this very briefly and give you a quick look into Israel. As we said when we opened this meeting about 2 hours ago, I cannot start this presentation without referring a little bit to the current events, which are unfortunately quite difficult. And I would like to open with a verse from Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, who was a prophet that had a lot of chapters of consolation. On the walls of Jerusalem, I've appointed watchmen all the day and all the night, continually. They are not silent. And I think this is appropriate also because in Israel, the past few days have been called Operation Watchmen of the Walls. And when we're thinking of watching the walls, of protecting Jerusalem as a symbol of heritage that belongs to the whole world, I think it brings up a lot of questions about the meaning of heritage, the meaning of shared heritage, the context of culture when peoples come together, and how we create culture together for the present, for the future, but how we can plan and preserve things with a lot of responsibility relating to our past as well. In fact, the picture that you see here is a picture from today. It is a picture of the World Heritage City of Akko. Some of you might have visited there in the past, in the conservation center that unfortunately has been burnt down today. And this is sad, not because of the physical building. This is sad because of the people who are involved in creating heritage together. And I believe that heritage always tells a complex story, whether it's an archaeological artifact or something of modern heritage. And it is our job here to make sure that it is independent of religious dictates. And we have to listen to the story of people who have lived in this area for thousands and thousands of years and make them public assets, not only of our own nationality. And this is where we all come together as a joint committee from so many places around the world to safeguard them for the future. So that is just an opening slide, and we all hope for better days when we won't need any more watchmen. My name is Leora Berry. I am an architect. I was born in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and I deal with my experience has been in urban planning. I worked in the Jerusalem municipality. I was a deputy city architect for several years, and then I went on to found a program that was a national program for the preservation of cultural heritage. So bringing in, on the one hand, a wide outlook, and then the preservation of particular sites also comes into play when we look at the values of what it is that we're trying to preserve, what is the story behind the sites themselves, and sometimes they come to play in specific artifacts. And I also spent 3 years as a director of the Bible Lands Museum, Jerusalem, which is an archaeological museum. So I find that these various scales of heritage all have to be integrated and come to play when we look at our lives in the city. A little bit about Israel, and I think its main challenge is a very, very small country, 22,000 kilometers, I believe, about the size of New Jersey. And I think there are two interesting components that I'd like to talk about in my presentation, stemming from the fact that there is so much cultural background, so much history in this region. So we call it the Bible Lands. As I said, I was the managing director of the Bible Lands Museum. On the one side, on the west of Egypt, and on the east, Mesopotamia, or Iraq and Iran of today. And on the other hand, it is a very small country with a challenge of a hugely growing population. In fact, the population rate is about 2%, which is about the population rate of developing countries. And yet in such a small country, sometimes we feel that Israel might even become a city on its own, one big city like a polis. And therefore the yin and yang of the open spaces and the developed spaces are in constant, I don't know if to say conflict or battle, but battle over the space, over land. And beneath all that, there's the layers of heritage that exist everywhere. So it's quite challenging how to plan, how to grow, and within that, how to ensure the quality of life for people from all sects of the population of society. And I would also like to just mention that about 20% of Israel's population is Arab. Another 20% is ultra-Orthodox, which is very religious Jews who have their own set of values. And trying to develop, to grow within this context is not always easy. On top of which, on the left here, you see an aerial view of Israel, and you can see even a little bit of white in the northern, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Israel is this area here. And so some of the areas are desert-like in the south, and in the northern areas, it is more green, even with a little bit of snow, and we do have a coastline line, and the lowest place on earth is the Dead Sea. So there's a lot of terrain differences, a lot of geographical differences, and of course these all affect the topography, the layout, and the development in the land for thousands of years. I'd like to take you into a spotlight, into one region of Israel, which is the Jezreel Valley, in Hebrew, Emek Israel. And as I said, in my experience, I have dealt with various scales in planning, and I think you can't do one without the other. So I'm going to take you to look at 3 case studies from a more top-down level, the national planning level, taking a look also at a bit of intangible heritage and how we can bring that in the regional level, and also looking at something with a community or a local level. So a little bit about the Jezreel Valley. The big photograph here on the right is of Tel Megiddo. Some people might recognize it as Armageddon. Armageddon, Ar is from the Hebrew word har, which a mound, and Megiddon is Megiddo. And for some it is a symbolic or perhaps a literal area of the battles of the armies, the end of time, and whatever that means religiously or symbolically, it definitely comes into play as a very important historical mound. Now, a tel is a little hill or a mound of civilizations that has been built over time, one on top of the other. And it is one of the main, or on the western side of the Jezreel Valley, which you could see in the background, which has been in the past decades been used for agriculture. So I wanted to look at the comprehensive outline plan for the Jezreel Valley region. And this is a top-down approach that takes into account not just various stakeholders within the region, but tries to create a planning tool integrating heritage, natural resources, and also areas of settlements, and how they can be perhaps used as clusters, define them as specific complexes around which tourism initiatives can grow. So what you see in this slide is a sort of the idea, and you can see here in the middle, there is a cluster. It has a nature reserve, a forest, a settlement, a trail, an area for parking, proposed heritage anchor, And when we look at the outcome, and this is from the plan itself, you can see these clusters, these purple clusters, used as planning tools. There were 7 that were identified within the Jezreel Valley, used as planning tools in order to guide development within them, give aid to public tourism initiatives, which automatically make economic growth, and of course also help the protection and preservation of the heritage sites within them, creating and allowing for the growth of visitor centers, of educational areas, and of a lot of cultural festivals that can happen within them as well. So if I look at the next slide, you will see that it did boost regional economic development. You can see some examples here of agricultural boutique kind of selling cheeses or honey, having areas for tourist accommodation, visiting archaeological sites like Sipori, and all this brings people together to be part of the initiatives together, and it really creates an infrastructure, perhaps even a resilient infrastructure, and a synergy between the planning initiatives, between the heritage sites and the tourism initiatives that together have brought to quite a lot of flourishing of this area of the Jezreel Valley. On the other hand, there was a beautiful project, I think, that looked at the people within this region and asked to really attract them and use them as the brain power to preserve intangible heritage. Now, what do I mean by intangible heritage? As we know, and we were seeing this in Israel today in the past few days, narratives are in the mouths of the people who tell the story. And when we look at the story of the land of Israel, we look at the story of each one in their own settlement, there is something that gives you identification, something for you to identify with. And when we're planning for huge urban changes in Israel in the next few decades, we're trying to find the anchors of heritage within the spatial areas to make our area unique, to allow people to identify with them. And in this particular program, there was created a digital infrastructure, really an internet site, where young people went to the older people in their settlement and interviewed them and allowed them to bring in from their albums, allowed them to bring in from several documents, photographs, and to upload them onto this internet site so that their own stories become part of the documentation. On the other hand, the regional council collected professional data from archives, from historians, from people from the universities nearby, creating sort of a multi-level documentation, some of it very personal, with personal stories, and on the other hand, bringing surveys, engineering surveys, architectural surveys, to create a very accessible platform. In the next slide here, you can see some of the people in their homes and in other community centers talking to the elderly, and really looking at this as human capital for the development of the digital infrastructure for preserving intangible heritage as well. Creating identification, creating local pride, and creating a network which also relates to the national networks of other institutions, of archives, so that it's all interconnected, which creates a much larger accessibility to people, whether they're professionals, whether the people from this region or from out of it. So it's really access to afterwards also curate exhibitions, festivals, or for research, for example. And the next case study also looks at a mound of heritage here. This is near the city of Yokneam, which is also in the region. And it really relates to the importance of education. That's goal number 4 here, I think. Of course, 11 and 11.4, but looking at how we integrate our heritage assets that are within our urban framework and our urban structure, and empowering the local community in the development work. So here you see children from the nearby school creating mud bricks and then working on the site in the development and the preservation of the site, and creating an affinity really between the children, their families, their classmates, to archaeology, and what it means to have such tremendous value of cultural heritage in their own surroundings. And not just that. Once they do work there, of course, with the Israel Antiquities Authority and with professional guidance, they were allowed to add on to this mound another layer of interpretation, another layer of illustrations of telling the story of the history of this archaeological mound, of this tell, and making this place not just an empty area that people work in, but becomes an attraction, a local tourism or a local community attraction where people can come and learn and play and learn about the history of the archaeology in their own area. So these were 3 layers within the Jezreel Valley, and I do want to zoom out here for a moment to talk a little bit about what this means on the broader view of Israel. And in 2019, Israel actually did publish a voluntary national review looking at how various goals are being achieved or are being promoted within various Israeli government ministries. And as I said, the growth of Israel is happening so rapidly, and the yin and yang of open spaces and urban spaces are becoming very, very tight. I think Ege said before that all the goals sort of are very interrelated. It's very difficult to isolate one from the other, and I completely agree with that. And one of the things that Israel has been promoting in the past few years is a national plan that integrates the open areas and the built areas. It's called Plan Number 35. And the idea is to balance the development with the protection of open spaces, which often have heritage value or cultural value in them. And this national plan, number 35, chose 5 different designations and divided the whole country into these 5 designations, creating different areas creating different guidelines for the development of these areas that are based. It's a map-based plan, and some are more development oriented and some are more preservation oriented. So it's like looking at open corridors, looking at clusters on a much larger scale, not just in the local area, but where do we have, how many cities do we have next to transportation areas, next to open areas, next to public or logistics centers, and all this comes into play on a very national outlay. There have also been a lot of bodies working in Israel in the past few years on the local level, creating community gardens, creating nature surveys for urban development, creating preservation of national heritage parks. And the one thing that I think is lacking or that is difficult to find is a single authority that looks at all these things together. I did mention earlier that I was part of a national government program that was aimed at preserving national heritage sites, but it was also aimed at trying to create a joint policy. So this perhaps is a beginning of an outlook to bring all the stakeholders of preservation and development together to create a more unified, holistic view of development and preservation of heritage together. I just want to end with this very last slide, which I didn't know about, and I found as I was preparing this presentation. There is a site called Social Impact Israel, which is really a blog of independent initiatives, not just governmental initiatives, that try to look at each goal separately and show various initiatives. It's a prism, really, of looking at the different goals, and I invite you to take a look if you're interested in how the SDGs are being promoted in Israel on a much more general view. That is for now. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer any if we have time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leora. I think the issues of having a landlocked area and it's a very small country. I mean, I live in Singapore, we're also very, very small. And there are real challenges on prioritization of plans and what needs to be protected and what needs to be developed. Right? What I will do is like for everyone who's here, Martin has wants to present very quickly, and then we do if we allow 15 more minutes when we can just finish off, and then we will have some questions and answers at the end. If that's all right, yeah? 15 minutes. Okay, so Martin, if you can do 10, 12 minutes, that will be great.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, dear colleagues. Let me present activities where the heritage conservation in Czechia is connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Martin Horáček. I'm an architectural historian and conservationist currently working as an associate professor at the Department of Art History at the University of Olomouc and at the Brno University of Technology. We can skip the details, of course. Some basic facts about my country. The Czech Republic, or shortly Czechia, is situated in Central Europe with about 10 million inhabitants. Until the year 1992, we were a part of Czechoslovakia, and since 2004, the country is a member of the European Union. The heritage conservation has a long tradition in the territory from the period of Austro-Hungarian monarchy in the 19th century. Similarly to other Central European countries, the state has a quite strong position in terms of heritage conservation. The main responsible bodies are the Ministry of Culture and the National Heritage Institute as a professional organization with several thousand employees. The current Cultural Heritage Act is valid since 1987 with later amendments. Today, the Czech Republic registers around 40,000 immovable protected monuments and also several hundred protected areas, so-called urban heritage reserves and heritage zones. Czechia boasts 14 World Heritage Sites. All of them are cultural heritage sites. However, some of them include the cultural landscape. Very quickly, the historical cores of Prague, Český Krumlov, Telč, and Kutná Hora, the village of Holašovice, the former Liechtenstein chateaus of Lednice and Valtice and their cultivated surroundings, the castle of Kroměříž and adjacent old gardens, the Renaissance castle of Litomyšl, the Baroque pilgrimage church in Žďár, the former Jewish quarter in the town of Třebíč, the mining region Erzgebirge, which is a transnational series with Germany, and the Kladruby landscape for breeding ceremonial horses, and particularly two sites which are closely connected to my personal life, the Baroque Holy Trinity column in Olomouc and the modernist Tugendhat house designed by Mies van der Rohe in the city of Brno. The ICOMOS Czech National Committee is one of the oldest national committees. It was founded just in 1965 after the Venice Charter adoption. Currently, we have about 70 members. The committee is divided into several subcommittees or working groups. From 2015, the president is Professor Václav Girsa, perhaps the most important architect conservationist in Czechia. His most famous achievement is the Český Krumlov castle renovation you can see on the image below. What are we dealing with now? The main current targets are the World Heritage Monitoring and Nomination Assistance, the New Building Act proposal corrections, examination of modernist infills in historic urban landscape, and perhaps the most threatened part of cultural heritage in Czechia today is the industrial architecture from the 19th century, which is disappearing very quickly being replaced mostly by commercial buildings. You can see below examples from Brno. Regarding sustainable development goals, I would like to mention several cases which are connected to various points of sustainable development goals as indicated below. First, after 1989, the end of the communist regime, the parliament passed the law allowing the property restitutions. That means properties nationalized or confiscated by communists returned to former owners or their families. It applied also to castles and manor houses previously owned by aristocrats like Český Šternberk and Častovovice on images. In most cases, the traditional relationship between the landmark and its supportive environment was re-established, while the landmark remained open for tourists and cultural activities. The owners usually support sustainable business like breweries, forestry, brickworks, and so connected to local communities and local economy. Generally, there is a good collaboration between the state, owners, municipalities, communities, and heritage protection bodies. Some properties were returned to the church, Catholic Church mostly. For example, the huge Broumov Benedictine monastery of medieval origin, later rebuilt as a Baroque masterpiece. In 1950, it was converted into a prison for nuns. In 1990, restituted. Today, the building is not inhabited by monks, but maintained by a private foundation, renovated and converted into a cultural and educational center and a dormitory open all year. Again, the site became the heart of culture in a remote borderland close to Poland. Another interesting case might be the World Heritage Site of Třebíč, where the former Jewish quarter and St. Procopius Basilica. Here's the Basilica, and the former Jewish quarter is this portion of the town. They have been listed as a site of former peaceful coexistence of Christians and Jews. However, the abandoned Jewish quarter was threatened by demolition in 1970s and 1980s. Fortunately, after 1989, the area was revitalized by the municipality and volunteers with the help of an American fund. On images, you can compare the situation from the turn of the 20th century and the building of the synagogue in 1990 and 2018 conditions after renovation. Another little bit different case is the renovation of the medieval tower called Jakobinka of the Rosenberg Castle in 2013-2019. A copy of a medieval crane was built and used, only local stone and wood was used, and traditional craftsmen and artisans employed. Many educational activities during the works have been developed, and you can find many videos on YouTube, for example. The collaboration between the state and local communities was excellent, and the case is currently nominated to Europa Nostra Award. We have some sites on the World Heritage tentative list where the SDG goals are naturally included. The town of Žatec and its surroundings with fields of hops as one of the sources of the brewing industry. Traditional agriculture and industrial architecture creates a unique landscape with continuity from the Middle Ages, regardless of the national majority, Germans, Jews, Czechs, and regardless political regimes. So it has been considered as a model example where the heritage works as a driver of development for the whole region. The same is true for the last example, the fish pond network in the so-called Třeboň Basin, where the traditional water management and fish farming continues from the Renaissance era. The picturesque town of Třeboň is full of medieval, Renaissance, and 19th century architecture, and its architectural heritage reserve is surrounded by the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And some references to the mentioned cases, and the last slide, which describes the Czech National Committee's program for the next years regarding sustainable development goals. I would like to highlight 5 points: strengthening links between Agenda 2030 and heritage conservation practice in Czechia, the collaboration between ICOMOS members and nature conservationists, the implementation of Agenda 2030 into the university curricula, balanced top-down and bottom-up heritage management planning, and say complex environmental approach support. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martin. So I think you provided like a vast information on the World Heritage sites in the Czech Republic. So that's good. So I have one question for each, and maybe people can chime in if they want. But Leora, for a site or like a country like Israel, where there's so much history and there's a lot of conflicts and whatnot, but how does the government prioritize which are areas of protection, what type of protection will there be, and what are parts that will be developed? You mentioned 5 types of divisions, right? And then how do they balance this out? Let's say, okay, this site will be for development, this site will be protected, and what based on I can imagine that all sites are layered in history. How does that
happen? I think there are a few things here that you're mentioning, and it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try and simplify it. On the planning level, there are plans that are national plans, and there is an example. There is a plan for heritage sites, or for national parks rather, and there are quite a few plans. You know, there's a plan for the coastline, and there's a plan for transport. And what I was referring to as the integrative plan of 35 tries to look at these things and create designated areas that create a balance between the number of create a balance that actually allows to development to a certain extent. So the Israel still has to grow in terms of development, and the boundaries are set so that it's not a percentage of each of these clusters, but it's, for example, creating corridors that are open spaces. It's creating buffer zones that are open, or it's creating areas that change from completely untouched areas to how they're integrated within urbanized space, while still relating to layers of cultural heritage or other values, natural values that can be within them. And within that, there are a lot of other planning checkpoints where other documents have to be inserted on other levels. It becomes quite heavy and quite layered. But I think you're also referring on, you asked the government, how does the government decide what to preserve and not to not? And that, of course, I think like every decision, and I think I gently tried to mention that in my opening slide, what is heritage, does often include political decisions which relate to the values that we give stories, the values that we give sites. And in that, for the moment, the government has to be responsible, and governments might change the way they look at things. But I think the community of heritage, people who are not responsible, who want to take part, want to preserve, there are a lot of the grassroots, there are a lot of the NGOs that try to affect those kind of decision makings. I mean, we do have Mike Turner is here, and I think I saw Iran here, who's the head of ICOMOS Israel, and they might have a different take on things. I think it is a question of responsibility, and it's a question of awareness. And I also mentioned education, because I think the more that we understand the complexities of the areas that we live in, call it Palestinians or versus Arabs versus ultra-Orthodox versus Druze versus Christians, and of course Israelis and secular Jews and it's like this bubble. And unfortunately, the past few days, it feels a little bit like a pressure cooker. You have to let things to vent. But as architects, as archaeologists, as people who are dealing with planning the environment, we cannot make mistakes, because what we have has a physical attribute, and it can change the environment, and that's why we have to be very, very careful.
The reason why I ask that is because in Singapore, it is the state who decides on all things. We are only 700 square kilometers, of land, and all of it is defined by the concept plan, the master plans that are created. And well, sad to say that the people who are here are not main stakeholders to those decisions. There was a law that was created wherein the government can buy the land at market value for any property in the whole of Singapore for any type of development. And that was because of this rule that the government owns everything. So that's why I asked that question. But let's have one question for Martin as well. And I want to raise a question on the typology that you've provided. You have provided multiple World Heritage sites, which are of wonderful monumental beauty and significance. But are there a lot of sites also in the Czech Republic that are looking at the more, let's say, down-to-earth kind of heritage? And are they protected? Let's say housing, small housing, or like small villages, rather than the big, let's say, big churches and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for the question. The Czech Republic doesn't have huge cities, so comparable to Singapore or Berlin, or we have just Prague as a city with 1 million inhabitants, but we have plenty of small villages. So the country is quite densely populated, but the population is spread within villages with, say, 200, 300 inhabitants. And there are plenty of such a small settlements with quite a beautiful vernacular architecture. And it's some of them are included in so-called heritage reserves or heritage protected zones. But many of them lost their traditional architecture, so they are not protected in any way. So if the question is if we have, say, some kind of normal or vernacular heritage against those spectacular monuments. So the answer is yes, we have, and we are trying to protect it. But of course, it's more difficult than to protect the mansions and churches and monasteries and so. Yeah, but just one of them is included into on the World Heritage list, the village of Holashovice, which was included on presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.